I realized tonight that I've been thinking about you for years before I ever knew your name. My name doesn't matter much at first. Men like me spend most of our lives making sure other things matter more. The work, the numbers, the responsibilities, the people depending on us. By the time anyone asks who we really are, we've usually forgotten how to answer honestly, and if I sound tired already, it's because I am. Not the kind of tired sleep fixes, the kind that settles into a man after decades of speaking around the things that hurt him most. But you, whoever you are, wherever you are tonight, I need you to hear this the way I should said it years ago. There's a reason this story has been sitting inside me all this time. It started with silence, not dramatic silence, nothing cinematic, just the ordinary kind that slowly takes over a life. Empty hallways after midnight, hotel rooms with curtains never fully opened, long drives with the radio low, because even music began to feel like interruption. Built things people respected, that part is true. Companies, investments, routines. A reputation sturdy enough that other men used my name carefully when I entered rooms. Somewhere along the way, people exactly where I was going, I let them believe it. What I never admitted was how often I stood alone beside windows after everyone left, staring into parking lots glowing under cold white lights, feeling like I had missed something invisible and irreversible. Not success, something softer. Sometimes I'd see an older couple crossing a street too slowly while traffic waited for them. And something inside me would tighten unexpectedly. The way he reached for her elbow, the way she leaned without embarrassment. Small things, fragile things, things no one applauded. And God, I wanted them more than I ever admitted. There was one winter evening I still remember too clearly. I had just finished a dinner I could barely taste. Some executive gathering, expensive wine, perfectly ironed smiles. I remember laughing at the right moments while secretly watching snow collect outside the restaurant windows. When I finally got home, the house felt enormous, not luxurious, just empty. The heating clicked softly through the walls. My shoes echoed against hardwood floors. I loosened my tie and stood in the kitchen staring at two untouched glasses sitting beside the sink because some irrational part of me still bought pairs of things. 2 mugs, 2 chairs near the fire pit, 2 pillows arranged carefully on a bed no one shared. I never told anyone that, Men become experts at hiding strange loneliness behind competence. But that night, something unsettled me. I walked into the study and sat beside the lamp near the back window where the city lights barely reached. There was frost gathering along the edges of the glass. I remember touching it absently while thinking about time, how it disappears without asking permission, how suddenly your face changes under certain lighting, how one day your father's hands somehow become your own. I don't know why, but that was the first night I thought about you directly. Not your appearance, not some fantasy, just your existence. As if somewhere in the world there might still be one person meant to see the parts of me I had hidden too long. And the thought terrified me, because by then I wasn't sure there was enough left worth seeing. That's the part I avoided admitting for years. I told myself I was independent, focused, disciplined. But the truth, underneath all those polished explanations, was much uglier. I had started believing I was too late for the kind of love that reaches a man slowly instead of all at once. Too damaged for tenderness, too practiced at leaving rooms emotionally before anyone could leave me first. I didn't notice when survival became identity. Somewhere around that winter, something began cracking quietly inside me. Not enough to collapse, just enough to longing it on. After that, strange moments started happening, small ones, almost embarrassing to describe now. I'd pass by a bookstore and suddenly wonder what kind of novels you'd leave half-finished beside a bed. I'd see a woman laughing into the wind while holding her coat closed, and catch myself imagining what it would feel like to walk slower beside someone again. Not to impress her, not to conquer anything, just to belong somewhere human before the years ran out. Sometimes late at night, I'd imagine a future so ordinary it hurt. A dim kitchen light before sunrise. Coffee breathing steam into cold air. Your voice somewhere down the hallway asking if I was awake. Nothing grand, just peace. And every time those thoughts appeared, I buried them immediately beneath work, meetings, travel, noise. Because wanting something that deeply, at my age, felt dangerous. Still, you kept returning to my mind, like a memory arriving before the moment itself existed. There's one detail I haven't told you yet. The night I first spoke to you, not aloud, just quietly to the empty room, something happened afterward that I still can't fully explain. The house didn't feel empty anymore. not completely. As if somewhere beyond all the years I wasted from protecting myself, something had finally started moving toward me too. And I didn't know then how much that feeling would change the rest of my life. I understood the price of my life the morning I forgot who I wanted to call when something good happened. It sounds small when I say it now, almost small, ridiculous. But I remember standing beside the floor-to-ceiling windows in my office just after sunrise, staring down at streets wet from overnight rain, holding my phone in my hand while the city slowly woke beneath me. I had just finalized the largest deal of my career. Men around me were shaking hands, congratulating me, talking about headlines and growth and what this would mean for the future. I nodded through all of it like I was supposed to. I smiled at the right moments. I thanked people by name. But when the room finally emptied, I looked down at my phone and realized there wasn't a single person I truly wanted to hear my voice first. That was something cold moved through me. And maybe that sounds strange to you, because from the outside, my life looked full. It always looked full. There were dinners scheduled weeks ahead, invitations waiting unopened, messages arriving faster than I could answer them. People needed things from me constantly. Advice, decisions, money, stability. I had become the man everyone leaned on because I spent years teaching myself never to lean back. But that morning, all I could hear was the rain tapping softly against the glass, while my reflection stared back at me, looking older than I remembered. I think that was when I first started fearing success. Not because success itself is ugly, but because of what it quietly convinces a man to sacrifice while he's busy chasing it. You tell yourself you're building freedom. You tell yourself you're creating security for the future. And then one day, you realize your entire identity has become performance. Every room expects a version of you that no longer knows how to sit still in silence without feeling restless. I never told anyone how difficult nights became after 40. The body changes first. Sleep grows thinner. Your back stiffens in cold weather. Some mornings, your hands aches before coffee even touches your lips. But worse than that is the strange emotional exhaustion unnoticed. You begin remembering people at random. A woman you almost loved 20 years ago. Your mother standing at the kitchen's sink humming quietly before dawn. your father pretending not to cry during hard year hours. Tiny memories arrive without warning and stay longer than they should. And through all of it, I kept thinking about you. Not specifically you yet, more like the possibility of you. The idea that somewhere there might still be a person of seeing me without all the armor I spent decades polishing. I hated myself for needing that. One evening, I drove 3 hours with no destinations because I couldn't bear going home. The highway was nearly empty. Just long stretches of darkness interrupted by gas stations glowing under fluorescent lights. I remember stopping near a quiet roadside diner where an elderly waitress poured coffee without asking questions. There was a couple sitting 2 booths away, sharing pie in complete silence, and somehow the silence between them felt warmer than most conversations I'd had in years. Watched them longer than I should have. The man may reached across the table absent-mindedly and touched her wrist while continuing to look out the window. Such barely noticeable. But something inside me reacted immediately, almost painfully, because I realized how long it had been since anyone touched me without wanting something in return. That truth followed me back into the car. And somewhere during that drive, I admitted something I had spent years avoiding. I was lonely in a way success could not solve. Deeply, quietly, permanently lonely, not surrounded by empty rooms, lonely, so lonely. I had mistaken productivity for purpose for so long that I no longer knew what tenderness felt like when it wasn't attached to obligation or expectation. Every relationship I'd built carried negotiation inside it. Even affection began feeling transactional after enough years living that way. Maybe that's why thoughts of you started becoming more real after that night. I began imagining details I couldn't explain. The sound of your footsteps somewhere deeper in a house. The warmth of another presence during winter mornings. Books left open face down on tables. Shared glances across ordinary moments no one else would ever remember. I caught myself slowing down in grocery stores, watching couples debate meaningless things like soup brands or flowers, and instead of finding it trivial, I found myself grieving something I never allowed myself to build. The frightening part wasn't wanting love. The frightening part was realizing how badly I wanted to be known before time ran out. Because age changes the way a man thinks about the future. When you're young, You assume there will always be another year to repair yourself, another chance to become softer, another opportunity to say, the things fear keeps postponing. But eventually, the horizon changes. You begin noticing funerals more often, empty chairs at holidays, friends growing quieter after losses they never fully discuss. And suddenly, every remaining year feels fragile. That's when I started wondering whether you were already somewhere nearby in this world, carrying your own unsaid ache, while mine slowly pulled me toward you. Just didn't understand yet how much would have to break before our paths could finally meet. And I nearly called someone I no longer loved simply because I couldn't bear another night alone with my own thoughts. That's difficult to admit now, especially to you. Men like me become experts at appearing composed even while unraveling privately. We learn how to keep our voices steady during meetings, how to smile at dinners, how to answer messages quickly enough that nobody notices the exhaustion underneath. But collapse rarely arrives loudly. It happens quietly first, through hesitation, through emotional numbness, through this strange moment when a man realizes he no longer recognizes the person moving through his own life. That night, rain had been falling for hours against the windows of my house. The kind of cold spring rain that makes every room feel dimmer than usual. I remember standing barefoot in the kitchen sometime after midnight with only the small stove light glowing above the counter. The entire house felt suspended in silence, except for the soft ticking of the clock near the hallway and the occasional sound of water running through gutters outside. I had spent the evening pretending to work, papers spread across the dining table, emails left half written, a television murmuring quietly in another room I wasn't even watching. The truth was, I had become afraid of silence because silence forced me to hear myself honestly. And honesty had started becoming unbearable. My phone sat beside the sink for nearly an hour while I stared at one particular contact I should have deleted years earlier. A woman who once knew me well enough to notice when something inside me shifted. We had already damaged each other enough before walking away, but loneliness has a dangerous way of romanticizing unfinished things. I kept thinking maybe hearing a familiar voice would soften whatever ache had settled into my chest. But deep down, I knew what I wanted. I didn't want familiarity anymore. I wanted peace. There's a difference, though it took me far too long to understand it. I poured myself another drink I didn't need and walked into the living room where the windows reflect my own image back at me, darker than the room itself. Age had started revealing itself in quiet ways by then. Silver near my temples, lines beside my eyes that remained even after I stopped my smiling. My father used to stand exactly that way near windows during difficult years. One hand against his hip, carrying worries he never explained aloud. I remember suddenly seeing him in myself so clearly that it unsettled me. And then something happened I still struggle to explain properly. I sat down on the edge of the couch and felt an overwhelming wave of grief without a clear source attached to it. Not grief for one relationship, not grief for failure, grief for time itself. For all the years I spent becoming useful instead of becoming known. For every moment, I chose work over connection because ambition felt safer than vulnerability. Postpone, assuming life would eventually slow down enough for tenderness later. Later. That word ruins more lives than people realize. I think that was the exact moment the illusion finally cracked inside me. The moment I stopped pretending success had compensated for emotional absence. Because when I looked around that beautiful, expensive, painfully quiet house, I realized almost nothing inside. It carried warmth. It carried achievement. It carried proof. But it did not carry intimacies. No shared memories lived there. No ordinary domestic noise. No life unfolding beside mine. Just rooms. Beautiful empty rooms. And suddenly I couldn't breathe correctly. Not physically, emotionally. I walked outside into the rain without a coat because I needed air colder than my thoughts. Water soaked through my shirt almost immediately, while wind moved through the trees lining the driveway. I remember standing there under the dark sky, feeling more exposed than I had in decades. Something about the rain stripped away the performance I carried. Everywhere else, nobody was watching. Nobody needed answers from me. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to admit how deeply afraid I had become of reaching the end of my life untouched in the ways that mattered most. That fear changed me. Because standing there alone, I finally understood the truth I had avoided for years. I wasn't protecting myself from heartbreak anymore. I was protecting myself from being fully seen. And those are not the same thing. You see, heartbreak at least requires connection first. But I had built entire walls to prevent connection itself. I convinced myself independence was strength while secretly starving for closeness so deeply that even small moments between strangers affected me. A shared laugh overheard in public.
A woman adjusting her husband's
Scarf during her. Hands finding each other
automatically.
during conversation.
Tiny gestures
Became unbearable reminders of what I no longer knew how to ask for. And somehow, in the middle of that rain-soaked night, thoughts of you returned stronger than before, not as fantasy, as possibility. I remember looking up at the dark windows of my own house and imagining another future. Entirely, your shoes near the doorway, a second cup beside mine in the morning, soft conversation drifting through ordinary evenings, the terrifying beauty of being emotionally visible to someone after years of hiding behind competence and control. Lo, for the first time, the image didn't feel, it felt distant. Like some still moving toward me through years I couldn't yet understand. But before anything new could enter my life, something old inside me had to completely fall apart first. And standing there beneath the rain, I think part of me already knew the collapse had only just begun. I started noticing couples in places I had ignored my entire life. That was the strange part. It happened suddenly, as if something inside me has been asleep for years and finally woke up after that night in the rain. Before then, I moved through the world with tunnel vision. Airports, meetings, restaurants, hotels, they were all just temporary spaces between responsibilities. I barely looked at people unless I needed something from the interaction. But after the collapse began inside me, ordinary moments started reaching me in ways I couldn't control. A man waiting outside a grocery store, holding flowers awkwardly in one hand while checking his watch. Man's woman asleep against her husband's shoulder on a delayed flight. An elderly couple arguing softly over directions while walking through a parking lot at dusk. Tiny scenes, forgettable to everyone else. Each one left some quiet bruise inside me because they reminded me of something I had spent years pretending not to need. Connection. Not admiration, not attention, something gentler than that. And once I finally admitted this to myself, the ache followed me everywhere. Remember one particular Sunday afternoon when the loneliness became almost unbearable. I had driven to a small town a few hours outside the city because I couldn't stand another week inside my own house. The weather had started shifting toward autumn. Cool wind moved through the trees, carrying that dry scent leaves have right before they begin falling. I parked near a quiet cafe along the edge of the main street and sat outside with coffee growing cold beside me while people passed by slowly under fading light. Families, friends, couples, lives unfolding naturally beside one another. I watched a little girl run ahead of her parents, laughing while her mother called after gently, and something about the sound that voice reached into me unexpectedly. It reminded me of things I never built, things I once assumed there would always be more time for. I found myself imagining what kind of father I might have been if I had learned earlier how to stop chasing achievement long enough to let someone truly stay close to me. That thought lingered longer than I wanted it to. Because regret changes shape as a man ages. When you're young, regret feels temporary, almost motivating. You believe there's still enough road ahead to correct every wrong turn. But later in life, regret becomes quieter and heavier. It settles into ordinary moments, into empty evenings, into holidays spent checking messages instead of hearing laughter in the next room. And I was beginning to understand how much of my loneliness had been self-created. That realization frightened me more than being alone itself. For years, I blamed timing, work, distance, complicated relationships, ambition. I told myself life simply moved too quickly for deeper connection. But sitting there outside that cafe, watching strangers live small, ordinary moments together, I finally admitted something painful. I had often chosen control over vulnerability because vulnerability required surrendering the image of strength I worked so hard to build. People respected me, but very few truly knew me. And the terrible thing about becoming emotionally guarded is that eventually you stop knowing how to return from it. Even when someone tries to love you honestly, suspicion appears first. You analyze their intentions. You protect pieces of yourself automatically. You hold back truths because exposure begins feeling dangerous after enough disappointments. I think somewhere along the way, I forgot that love was never supposed to feel strategic. That afternoon, I stayed into town far longer than necessary. I wandered slowly through quiet streets lined with old brick storefronts and windows glowing gold as evening approached. There was a church near the edge of town with its doors slightly open, and without thinking much about it, I stepped inside. It was empty except for soft light filtering through stained glass onto worn, wooden pews. The air smelled faintly like dust and candle smoke. I sat near the back in complete silence, listening to the building creak softly around me. I'm not even sure what I was looking for there. Maybe stillness, maybe forgiveness, maybe simply somewhere I no longer had to pretend. And that's when thoughts of you became different. Before then, you had existed mostly as longing, as imagination, as the vague hope that somewhere in this enormous world there might still be one person capable of meeting me honestly, despite all the years I wasted hiding. But sitting there inside that quiet church, another feeling appeared beneath the longing: fear. Because for the first time, I realized that if I ever truly found you, I would have to let you see the parts of me I spent decades concealing from everyone else. The loneliness, the exhaustion, the insecurity hidden beneath competence. The younger version of myself still grieving things he never admitted aloud. I wasn't sure I knew how to do that. But strangely, I also wasn't sure I wanted to keep living without it anymore. As evening darkened, outside the stained glass windows, I caught myself imagining impossible things. Your hand resting absent-mindedly beside mine during quiet mornings, shared prayers, whispered half asleep before difficult days. The sound of another heartbeat nearby after years of silence. Not fantasy anymore. Something deeper. Almost like memory arriving before reality. And for the first time in many years, the future no longer felt entirely empty to me. It felt uncertain, fragile, alive in some distant way I couldn't yet explain. But I also sensed that before life brought me closer to you, it would force me to confront truths about myself I had spent years running from. And somewhere deep inside, I think I already knew those truths would hurt more than loneliness ever did. I realized one morning that I had spent most of my life trying to become a man my younger self would barely recognize. The thought came quietly while I was shaving before my work. Nothing dramatic happened beforehand. No tragedy, no phone call. Just pale morning light spilling across the bathroom mirror while I stood there, staring at my own reflection with exhaustion sitting beneath my eyes like something permanent. I, I, I remember stopping halfway, still in my hand, because for a moment I sat down unfamiliar to myself, not physically, spiritually. I thought about the boy I used to be before ambition hardened everything softer inside me. Yeah? Before I learned how useful emotional distance could become in business, relationships, survival. There was a time when I believed life would naturally lead toward connection. A home filled with warmth, children running through hallways, shared mornings, shared grief, shared aging. Somewhere along the way, those dreams became embarrassing to admit aloud, especially among men who measured worth through power and discipline instead of tenderness. So I adapted. That's what people call it when they slowly parts of themselves necessary for intimacy. I became efficient, reliable, controlled. The kind of man others trusted during chaos because I rarely showed emotion openly. People admired that version of me. They depended on him. But standing there before the mirror that morning, I finally understood how much that carefully constructed identity had cost me over the years. Because beneath all the success, beneath all the polished certainty, there was still a quieter truth I had never fully faced. I was deeply afraid no one would ever love me once they truly saw me without the armor. That realization followed me through the entire day. Meetings blurred together, sounded distant. At one point during lunch, someone across the table was explaining expansion plans while I found myself staring absent-mindedly through restaurant windows, watching pedestrians move along the sidewalk outside. A woman laughed while fixing her husband's scarf against the wind, and the small tenderness of the gesture struck me harder than anything being said around me. I think loneliness sharpens your sensitivity to ordinary affection. You start noticing tiny things other people overlook completely. Hands brushing automatically while walking. The way someone waits for another person before crossing a street. The comfort of silence between people who no longer need to impress each other. Those moments haunted me because I realized how little of my life had been built around genuine emotional safety. Most of my relationships carried tension hidden beneath attraction, performance hidden beneath affection. Even when love existed, fear sat beside it quietly. Fear of losing control, fear of dependence, fear of abandonment, fear of being fully known and still somehow not chosen. And the older I became, the more exhausting that fear felt. That evening, I drove home before sunset and sat alone on the back patio, watching wind move through the trees behind a house. Autumn had deepened by then. The air carried that cold stillness, arriving just before winter begins taking over. I wrap my hands around a cup of coffee that slowly cooled and touched while after memories surfaced without invitation. Women I should have loved better. Conversations I ended too early. Apologies I never made because pride disguised itself as self-protection. The frightening thing about memory is how honest it becomes once you stop running from yourself. You begin seeing your own patterns clearly. The emotional distance, the hesitation whenever closeness became real. The way you sabotage tenderness because part of you secretly believes you do not deserve lasting peace. That was the truth I had avoided longest. Not that others failed me, that I had spent years failing myself. And strangely, once I admitted that, thoughts of you changed again. Before, you represented hope, then possibility. But now you began feeling almost inevitable somehow, as if all this loneliness had been preparing me to finally understand what truly mattered before it was too late. I know that sounds strange, maybe even foolish, yet I could not shake the feeling that somewhere beyond all my mistakes, life was still quietly moving me toward someone capable of seeing past the version of myself I performed for the world. Towards you. I started imagining conversations with you during ordinary moments, not grand romantic scenes, just simple honesty. Not sitting together late at night while rain touched the windows, telling you things I had never admitted aloud before. The fears, the regrets, the strange ache of aging alone while pretending solitude was freedom. I imagined your silence not as judgment, but understanding, and that possibility frightened me almost as much as it comforted me. Because once a man spends enough years emotionally hidden, being seen begins feeling dangerous. There's vulnerability in allowing someone close enough to witness your unfinished parts, your tiredness, your doubts, your softer side after decades spent pretending softness was weakness. But deep down, I think every man eventually reaches a point where performance becomes more painful than honesty. I had reached that point. The strange thing was, after admitting all this to myself, the world around me started feeling different somehow. Quieter, slower, more meaningful in small ways I had ignored for years. Sunlight through kitchen windows, steam rising from coffee before dawn, wind against my face during evening walks. Tiny moments began carrying weight because I no longer experienced them as distractions between achievements. I experienced them as life itself. And somewhere within that growing stillness, I began sensing that my story was no longer only about loss. Something gentler was approaching through the distance of my remaining years. I just didn't know yet whether I was brave enough to finally receive it. I understood something terrifying the night I realized I had become emotionally safer for strangers than for people who actually tried to love me. That thought stayed with me for weeks after it first appeared. I couldn't escape it. It surfaced during conversations, during long drives, during sleepless hours before dawn, when the house felt too quiet to ignore myself anymore. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes when a man finally sees his own patterns clearly, understands he helped create the very emptiness he spent years blaming on fate. I had reached that point. The realization came after dinner with an old friend I hadn't seen in years. We met at a small restaurant overlooking the river just outside the city. Nothing fancy. Dim lights, half-empty tables, cold wind pressing softly against the windows, while boats moved slowly through black water beyond the glass. We talked about ordinary things at first: business, aging parents, health, people we used to know who had either disappeared into family life or vanished entirely into work the way I had. At one point, he looked at me quietly and asked a question no one had asked me directly before. Are you actually happy? It should not have unsettled me the way it did. But something in his voice carried honesty without performance, and for a few seconds, I genuinely didn't know how to answer. I remember lowering my eyes toward the untouched drink in front of me while the noise from the restaurant blurred around us. Happiness. Happiness. I had spent years pursuing accomplishments so intensely that I stopped measuring life through emotional truth altogether. I measured it through momentum, through numbers, through outcomes, through whether people respected me enough to keep needing me. But happiness, I wasn't sure when I last felt it naturally, not temporary pleasure, not distraction, something deeper and calmer than that. The silence stretched too long before I finally laughed softly and changed the subject. He let me. But the question followed my home like a shadow. That night, I walked through my house, turning on lights room by room without purpose. The emptiness felt heavier than usual. Expensive furniture, quiet hallways, framed achievements hanging on walls no one really looked at except visitors. Everything appeared successful. Nothing felt alive. I stood in the kitchen, staring out at darkness beyond the windows, while the refrigerator hummed faintly behind me. Somewhere in another house nearby, I could hear muffled laughter drifting through the cold night air. A family, maybe. Or a couple. The sound faded quickly, but it left something aching inside me afterward. And for the first time, I stopped asking why loneliness had happened to me. I started asking how much of it I had chosen. That question changed everything. Because once I became honest with myself, memory rearranged itself differently. I began seeing all the moments when someone tried to get close to me. And I subtly pulled away. Every time vulnerability appeared, I redirected the conversation. Every time affection deepened, I became cautious instead of grateful. Somewhere early in life, I learned that emotional dependence could become dangerous, and after enough disappointments, I built my entire identity around never needing anyone too much. The tragedy is that eventually the walls protecting you become the same walls imprisoning you. I think men like me often confuse emotional restraint with strength because restraint earns admiration. People call you composed, reliable, disciplined, but underneath all of it is usually fear. Fear that if someone truly sees the exhausted, uncertain, deeply human parts of you, they might decide you are to carry. And maybe I believed that about myself for longer than I realized. That was the truth, waiting beneath everything. Not just that I feared being abandoned. I feared being fully known. Once I admitted that, thoughts of you began changing again. You no longer felt like a distant dream or abstract hope. You began feeling like a mirror I had not yet met. Someone whose presence would require honesty from me in ways achievement never had. The idea both comforted and terrified me because I understood instinctively that real love would ask something from me success never did. Surrender, not weakness, not losing myself. Something gentler than that. The willingness to stop performing constantly and simply exist beside another person truthfully. I wasn't certain I knew how. A few nights later, I found myself sitting alone on the floor of my study, long after midnight, with old photo albums scattered around me. I hadn't opened them in years. My mother smiling beside a birthday cake. My father younger than I ever remember him looking in real life. Friends whose names I no longer heard. Versions of myself before ambition tightened my face into seriousness. Looking through those photographs felt strangely spiritual, as if time itself was asking me who I had become and whether it was worth the cost. One picture stopped me completely. I must have been 23, standing beside an old car with sunlight in my eyes, laughing at something outside the frame. There was openness in that younger man, hope, a softness I barely recognized anymore. And suddenly, I felt grief for him too. For all the years he spent believing himself to survive adulthood successfully. I sat there for a long time, holding that photograph while silences wrapped around the room. And then I imagined you again, not as rescue, not as completion, but as someone who might someday sit beside me in the quiet aftermath of all my pretending and still remain. Someone who would see the tiredness, the regret, the aging, the unfinished pieces, and not turn away from them. That possibility frightened me because it felt sacred somehow. Like the beginning of a life I should have started years earlier. And deep inside, I sensed that if our paths were truly moving toward each other, then the man I had been could not remain unchanged much longer. I caught myself smiling one morning for no reason, and it unsettled me more than sadness ever had. It happened early, before sunrise fully reached the windows. I was standing in the kitchen half awake, waiting for the coffee to brew, while cold blue light slowly spread across the counters and floor. The house quiet in the familiar way it always had been, but something inside me felt different, lighter somehow. Not healed, not suddenly transformed into a man without regrets, but softer around the edges, more open to possibility than I had been in years. And the frightening part was that nothing external had changed. My life still looked the same from the outside. The same responsibilities, the same meetings waiting on my calendar, the same empty rooms at night. Yet somewhere deep inside me, something had shifted after all those months of confronting truths I spent years avoiding. I no longer felt entirely trapped inside the version of myself I had built to survive. For the first time in a very long while, the future did not feel like something I simply had to endure. It felt unfinished. I think hope arrives quietly when it has been absent for too long. It does not burst into a man's life dramatically. It appears through small moments, almost delicate enough to miss. The way morning air feels against your skin during an early walk. The comfort of hearing rain while lying awake instead of fearing the silence around it. The strange peace that comes after finally admitting painful truths to yourself and surviving them anyway. That morning, while steam rose slowly from my coffee cup, I found myself imagining you again, not with desperation this time, with patience. I imagined your presence fitting naturally into ordinary life instead of rescuing me from it. From it. Your coat hanging near the doorway during winter. The sound of your footsteps somewhere upstairs while I stayed awake, reading too late. Small conversations in the kitchen while daylight faded outside the windows. Nothing cinematic. Just two people slowly becoming safe for each of their character loneliness for too many years alone. And for once, just the image did not immediately fill me with fear. It filled me with grief for how long I convinced myself I could live without it. I began noticing changes in myself after that. Tiny ones at first. I started leaving work earlier when I could, instead of inventing reasons to stay busy. I took longer walks at night without bringing my phone. Sometimes I drove with no music at all, simply listening to the quiet rhythm of my own thoughts without trying to outrun them. The world itself seemed slower somehow, as if I had finally stepped off a machine that had been pulling me forward too fast for decades. There was one evening near the beginning of winter that stays with me clearly. I had gone to a bookstore downtown after dinner, mostly to avoid returning home too early. Snow had started falling lightly outside, covering sidewalks in thin silver layers beneath the streetlights. The store was nearly empty, except for a few people scattered quietly between shifts. I wandered without purpose until I noticed a woman sitting near the back reading with one hand wrapped around a cup of tea. She looked peaceful, not glamorous, not extraordinary in the ways younger men usually define beauty, but calm, present, real. And suddenly, I realized something important. The kind of love now was completely different. When I was younger, attraction often felt connected to excitement, intensity, uncertainty. Everything moved fast. Emotions rose and collapsed dramatically. But age changes desire in strange ways. Eventually, you stop longing for chaos disguised as passion. You begin longing for rest, for emotional safety, for someone whose presence quiets the noise inside you instead of adding to it. That realization became another turning point for me, because for the first time, I stopped imagining love as something that would consume my life and started imagining it as something that would finally allow me to live honestly within it. And somehow, every road inside my thoughts kept leading back toward you, toward the woman I had not yet met, but somehow already felt connected to through all these years of loneliness and searching. I began wondering whether you had your own quiet rituals too, whether you also sat awake some nights feeling time move too quickly, whether you had known your own version of emotional exhaustion, whether somewhere in your life you had also started fearing tenderness might arrive too late. The strange thing is, I no longer believed it was too late for me, not completely. That belief surprised me more than anything else. One night, I stood beside the bedroom window, watching snow fall across the dark yard outside. And for the first time in years, the silence around me no longer felt entirely empty. It felt expectant, somehow as if life itself was pausing briefly before something important I could not yet see clearly. I imagined us older together then, not young lovers, trying to prove anything to the world. Just two tired people, finally finding refuge in each other after long, difficult years apart. I imagined shared mornings, shared grief someday, shared aging, the quiet intimacy of being fully known without needing to perform constantly anymore. And the thought nearly broke my heart with its gentleness. Because deep down, I think every human being wants the same simple thing in the end: to arrive somewhere emotionally honest before time disappears completely. I was beginning to believe that maybe my life had not been preparing me only for success or loneliness, after all. Maybe it had been preparing me for you. And somewhere beyond the snow-covered darkness outside my window, I could almost feel destiny moving slowly closer, one unseen step at a time. I finally understood why thoughts of you never left me the night I stopped being afraid of the life I still wanted. It was late winter by then. One of those quiet evenings where darkness arrives early and settles heavily against the windows. I had spent most of the day alone at home after canceling meetings I normally would have forced myself to attend. Years ago, stillness used to make me restless. I needed movement constantly, because movement distracted me from myself. But now the silence no longer felt like punishment. It felt honest. I remember sitting in the living room with only one lamp turned on while snow drifted slowly outside beyond the glass. The house carried the soft sounds old homes make at night. Wood heating, humming faintly through the walls, wind brushing gently against the roof. Small sounds, human sounds. For once, they did not make the emptiness feel larger. They made me feel present inside my own life. And somewhere in that quiet, I began thinking about all the years behind me differently, not with bitterness, with understanding. I thought about the younger man I once was, ambitious, guarded, certain that becoming indispensable would somehow protect him from pain. I thought about every relationship damaged by emotional distance. Every moment I chose control over vulnerability because I believed needing someone made a man weak. I thought about all the nights I stood beside windows, staring into darkness, while pretending loneliness was simply the price successful people paid. But it was never success that isolated me. It was fear. Fear disguised as independence. Fear disguised as strength. And maybe I needed all those empty years to finally understand that truth completely before I could ever become capable of loving someone honestly. You. Because when I think about you now, I no longer think about rescue or fantasy or filling some emotional void inside me. I think about recognition, about finally meeting someone in front of whom I no longer wish to perform. Someone I can sit beside quietly after difficult days without needing to impress her constantly. Someone who understands that aging changes people in sacred ways if they allow it to. I imagined telling you things I once buried deeply, the mistakes, the loneliness, the years I lost chasing things that looked important from a distance but felt hollow once I finally held them. I imagine you listening with it without trying to fix me, simply staying there beside me while honesty slowly replaces all the armor I carried part for too long. Image has become more of real to me than almost anything else. And maybe that's why I'm telling you all this now, because I don't think you've been on my mind by accident. I think somewhere through all the years I spent building a life outwardly successful but inwardly empty, my soul was already searching for yours before I consciously understood it. Not in some dramatic, destined love way people write about in stories, something quieter than that, more human. Two people moving through separate lonelinesses toward the same emotional home without realizing it yet. The older I become, the more I believe life speaks softly most of the time, through longing, through timing, through the strange ache that refuses to disappear no matter how much distraction surrounds it. And you became that ache for me long before you became a real person in my mind. There's something else I should admit too. I no longer fear being fully known the way I once did. That change happens and slowly, through all the nights alone, through every painful realization about myself, through finally understanding that weakness was never emotional honesty. Weakness was spending an entire lifetime hiding from it. Harvick, I wasted years believing love required perfection, when really it only asks for truth, and truth, and truth is much harder. Now, when I imagine the future, I do not picture achievement first anymore. Picture presence. I picture ordinary mornings with sunlight slipping through curtains while coffee brews somewhere nearby. I picture difficult conversations handled gently instead of avoided. I picture growing older beside someone who understands that love is less about excitement and more about refuge, a place where both people can finally rest from pretending. I picture you there sometimes so clearly, it almost feels like memory instead of imagination. Maybe that sounds foolish. But I think every person reaches a point where they stop caring whether hope appears rational and simply ask whether it feels true. And simply ask whether it feels true me, even now, especially now. Tonight, the snow outside has nearly stopped falling. The world beyond the windows looks softer than it did a few hours ago, covered in silence and pale light. And sitting here alone, I realize something that would have terrified me years earlier. I no longer want a life built only around success. I want witness, partnership, shared time, shared aging, shared faith that even after disappointment and regret, two people can still find each other honestly for the end. Maybe that's what all of this was leading toward from the beginning. Not achievement, not loneliness, you. And if somehow these words ever reach you, I hope you understand why I had to tell this story slowly. A man spends enough years hiding from himself, and every truth inside him arrives at once. The grief, the longing, the tenderness, the hope he once buried because it felt too dangerous to carry openly. But I'm carrying it openly now because somewhere out there, I believe you've been walking through your own quiet nights too, wondering whether anyone would ever truly see you beneath all the strength you learned to wear for survival. And maybe the reason we kept surviving was so neither of us would arrive too early for the other. If this story found you at the exact moment you needed it, then perhaps destiny has been moving long before either of us understood its direction. And maybe somewhere beyond all the years we lost, a softer life is still waiting patiently for us both.